Welcome back to the Monster Lab. This week, thanks to your votes, we'll be dissecting and analyzing one of the most fascinating creatures in all the realms, the Aboleth. If your knowledge of the lore and history for this primordial aberration is limited to the 5th edition, then you have hardly scratched the surface of these often overlooked ancient aliens of the Dungeons & Dragons ecosystem. So in the lab today, I've gathered the most astounding and insightful lore across all 6 scholarly versions presented for your review. Living embodiments of eldritch horror, the Aboleth offer a level of complex narrative depth rivaled by few other creatures, and yet are one of the least studied or understood. Well, today we fix that. Its origins and lore, of course, but we will also uncover some surprising and well-hidden secrets from past editions of the game. From the birth of gods and the apex of evolution, to the fetid bogs of the 9 hells and world domination, the Aboleth lore will surprise. And I'm confident most of you, maybe all of you, will learn something new today. Before we are fully beguiled by the dominant will of the Aboleth in today's volume, I wanted to be clear about my vision for this lore profile. I personally find what limited official art is available on the Aboleth to be very underwhelming, and not at all representative of their formidable nature. I feel the same way about the 5e stat block to a lesser degree. In fact, I'm convinced this is at least one of the reasons that the Aboleth are polarizing to some and not as popular as other aberrations like the Beholder, for example, a nightmare creature for which there is plenty of diverse and visual flavor. So while I will provide what limited official art is available as a framing reference, right now in fact, I think not spreading the wings of creativity to reimagine this ancient and alien Leviathan in order to instill some much-needed Lovecraftian dread would be both a tragic sin of omission and at least visually quite boring. If ever a monster deserved some visual empowerment, it's the Aboleth. I mean, the evidence is on your screen right now. This volume is one of, if not the most comprehensive lore profiles I've ever done on a single monster. The designer spent a great deal of time creating layers of depth that are just not matched, in fact, are neutralized by this lack of visuals. I think the Aboleth are one of the more exciting monsters to build around, and there was zero chance I was going to create an hour-long volume and not enhance this underrated aberration. This is a game built on the imagination of countless players and dungeon masters across endless tables, so I hope you will have an open mind. Also, be sure to stick around to the end where I'll offer some sage DM and world-building advice for best running the Aboleth in your next adventure or campaign. Okay, break out your scribing tomes, fellow lore scholars. We have a lot to discover. On some level, there's something uniquely terrifying about dark waters that most of us can connect with. Something disquieting about the unknown and the unseen rising up from the deep below. Like a primal sense or a sudden feeling of doom, you know it's there without fully realizing it, until fear grips its cold hands around your soul, your heart races uncontrollably, and adrenaline courses through your veins to every organ like a raging river. Your fight or flight instinct has engaged. It has taken control of your every action, your every thought. Thalassophobia is a persistent and intense fear of deep bodies of water, such as the ocean, seas, or the shrouded depths of the cavernous lakes of the Underdark. And today's subject of our discoveries embodies every facet of those mortal fears perfectly. They are ancient, they are alien, and they are all-knowing. Aboleth are the dread lurking in those impenetrable waters, the fear in the back of our minds, and the sum of all unknowns in the deep recesses of our subconscious. Take a moment to imagine the primordial fusion of a massive sea monster with an amphibious, lamprey-like eel, starting at 20 feet in length, for the smallest and most common. Now empower that creature with a level of intelligence that surpasses the mortal mind, and with psionic powers to rival any beholder or mind flayer, and you're just starting to get the picture of what this dread of the deep brings to an adventure or campaign. Oh, and did I fail to mention that they're also biologically immortal, have the ability to bend your mind to its will, and even change the physical form your body takes, resulting in your enslavement, all to suit its alien desires and grand ambitions. Yeah, this is one monster to study and know well. Your life may just depend on it. Before the Aboleth graced the pages of Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition, its inspiration finds roots in the etched runes of Nordic sagas, before tracing its lineage to the more modern-day eldritch horrors of H.P. Lovecraft's literary works. The echoes of Norse mythologies resonate well within Aboleth lore, possessing attributes reminiscent of the Jotun Titans and the world serpent Jormungandr, as attested throughout the Old Norse record. The Aboleth lore certainly follows a narrative of archaic and eternal, as primordial beings that both witnessed the birth of gods and the shaping of the multiverse. Beyond these most ancient of influences, the inspiration most obvious is found in the Cyclopean architectures represented throughout the Lovecraftian universe, and it is here that the Aboleth find their intentional resemblance with the great old ones of the Cthulhu mythos. And it is with that design intent that the Aboleth were created by TSR alum and notable fantasy writer David Zeb Cook. Introduced for the 1st edition of Dungeons & Dragons on the pages of the 1981 adventure module Dwellers of the Forbidden City, and 2 years later being printed in the Monster Manual 2. Clearly embracing the Lovecraftian model, these ancient aberrations now forever lurk in unseen depths, created to epitomize the fear of what lies beneath the surface of dark waters. I have only recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, come to embrace the Lovecraftian mythos. While I do not claim any provenance or expertise in the area, I do find it fascinating. And it is that fascination, along with what the 5th edition has done and not done to the Aboleth, that has shaped the trajectory for this video. The single version of the Aboleth provided in the 5th edition is, in my opinion, both lacking and flawed. And while I will touch upon that throughout our discoveries today, you should first be aware that the Challenge Rating 10 version in that 5e Monster Manual should be considered the most common and lesser of the many variants that have been officially created throughout the years and that I will detail for you today. So as we work our way through a mountain of lore today across all 6 versions of Dungeons & Dragons, I would offer this disclaimer, by hazarding a guess that at least 80% of the lore today will come from non-5th edition sources, with the bulk coming from the 2nd and 3rd editions, as well as one significant facet coming from the 4th edition. Much of this still applies to the 5th edition in my opinion, simply providing additional layers and choice, but I will try to point out where any hard conflicts might exist so that you can make your own decisions. Before the concept of time, before there was anything, there was nothing. And before there was nothing, there were the Elder Evils and the Aboleth. The Aboleth are believed to be the oldest sentient life in existence, and according to their own origin story, they were the spawn of the Elder Evils and at one time held dominion of these nascent worlds. For countless millennia, they were the unquestioned masters. Rulers in the abyssal depths of the world's oceans, they built great empires, mastered the dark arts and advanced sciences, and enslaved the lesser creatures of both land and sea. Yet their thirst for knowledge, dominion, and control knew no bounds. All this before the gods arrived and left them to ruin. For as their dominion expanded as overlords of all, so did their hubris, until the inevitable rise of religion among their subjugated thralls. From the despair of their enslavement and their cries for help, the gods were born and empowered with the worship of the devoted, heralding the downfall of this grand Abolethic dynasty. Eons later, an empire in ruins, their kind not destroyed but exiled to the deepest oceans and the cavernous lakes of the Underdark. Their era of dominance, long past, today an enduring animus for the gods has taken root in the twin hearts of every Aboleth since. The arrogance of the gods to claim ownership of the world fuels an insatiable desire for vengeance that drives every action they make to this day. And amidst it all, the Aboleth stand defiant, unbowed by gods they witnessed form. They have no religion and kneel to nothing but their own myopic goal to reclaim what was once theirs. The Aboleth are the textbook example of a patient race, ever scheming in the depths, a silent vow of retribution. While the Aboleth have existed on the prime material plane for nearly all of time, they, like all aberrations, did not originate here. So where did they come from? Until recently, 2014 to be exact, I thought the matter was settled, but perhaps not. To be clear, we're not here to determine the canonical truth. If you're an unflinching devotee of the 5th edition, then that matter seems to have been settled as far as the 5e lore is concerned, I think. The controversy arose with the release of the 5th edition Monster Manual and an almost throwaway line. Right there on page 14. Quote, "If an Aboleth's body is destroyed, its spirit returns to the elemental plane of water." End quote. So it's settled the Aboleth originated from the elemental plane of water, right? I mean, if you have a very reductive and elementary perspective, I guess that makes some sense. An ancient primordial monster of the lakes, seas, and oceans, the plane of water. All done, simple. Well, not so fast. Let's take a moment to review the lore a bit closer, because not only have I found the first occurrence, for me personally, where I stand with and strongly adopt the lore presented in the 4th edition, that the Aboleths actually hail from the far realm. Trust me, I'm more surprised than you. But I am more than a little baffled at the 5th edition logic for making such a claim. So much so, one has to ask if perhaps it's just a typo or a poorly worded single sentence. That, or in my opinion, those responsible have a deep, fundamental misunderstanding of the creature's lore. Since their creation in the 1st edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons all the way through the 3rd and 3.5 editions, the Aboleth lore did not explicitly state their plane of origination, but it was hinted at. Now, understanding the lore of the Far Realm requires its own volume of study. But in brief, since the 2nd edition where the Far Realm was actually introduced in the 1996 adventure Gates of Firestorm Peak, the Aboleth existence has mostly been tied to the Elder Evils, specifically confirming that they were created by the Elder Evil Pisethis, the Blood Queen. As an interesting side note, I recently found in my research a rumor swirling that insists Pisethis now resides in a lair near a fetid bog on Mineros, Mammon's 3rd lair of the 9 hells, instantly elevating the Blood Queen on my list of Elder Evils I look forward to profiling. Regardless, in the 4th edition, we get the first canonical, no doubt black and white text confirming that indeed the Aboleth hail from the Far Realm. And while I have numerous deep-seated issues with much of the 4th edition lore, especially when it comes to the planes of existence, their explicit claim that these aberrations were indeed from the Far Realm is not one of them, because it makes the most logical sense and only confirms what was heavily intimated, if not outright stated, in previous editions. Looking across the multiverse, we find several examples of ancient powers and world-ending monsters from virtually every plane, but the most eldritch of those have historically originated from the Far Realm, a location of infinite madness and Lovecraftian horror if ever one existed. The Far Realm exists outside of and has no place in our multiverse regardless of your preferred cosmological model, be that the World Tree, the World Axis, or my own choice, the Great Wheel. And this is because the Far Realm, by design, defies any attempt at uniformity or categorization. In fact, the Far Realm makes Limbo look like Mechanus, if you get my drift. The Far Realm is a dimension of chaotic energies that defy mortal understanding, much like the Aboleth and the Elder Evils that spawned them there. And the supporting evidence for the Far Realm is certainly circumstantial, but in my opinion also overwhelming. Their psionic abilities, alien intellect, and incomprehensible memory, as well as the long-standing canonical lore that the Elder Evils hail from the Far Realm and that they created the Aboleth. All fitting manifestations for this extraplanar heritage, and none of which has been challenged in the 5th edition, except for that throwaway line. I could go on and talk about Shifu, the Abolethic city that maybe still hovers above the Sea of Fallen Stars, ruled by an ancient Aboleth known as the Eldest. All part of the Abolethic sovereignty, an ancient empire of Aboleth from the Far Realm, and as a side note, also a pretty decent series of books. All of this does more than suggest that the Aboleth originate from the Far Realm. But Aboleth swim in water, so let's erase all that and offer no replacement. Well, not at my table, Wizbro. Not at my table. So, hey, score 1 for the 4th edition. I don't say that very often. I can think of no better way to begin our discovery on the physical aspects of the Aboleth than to provide a public service announcement on the creature's behalf by asking others to refrain from calling these aberrations fish-like creatures. Now I concede that the word fish is probably the simplest way to communicate that this is an aquatic, water-dwelling creature, which is mostly true. And the word fish is about as broad a terminology as one can find, given that it covers everything from a sea bass to a megalodon. But that descriptor does this aberrant creature no favors, and only detracts from its true visual, which is actually much closer to a Lovecraftian, serpent-like sea monster, a gigantic moray eel. Heck, even calling it worm or lamprey-like is both more suitable and accurate. Regardless, the Aboleth's form is a divergence from the typical terrestrial, aquatic, or even amphibious species of the realms. Its uniqueness is unrivaled, and understanding that physical makeup will offer us the truest insights into its predatory nature, its ability to survive through the eons, and exactly what makes the Aboleth so very special and dangerous. There is much to discover and marvel at when it comes to the alien anatomy of the Aboleth. Let's start by discussing a physical form that has changed much over 6 editions of scholarly study, suggesting that the specific details of its outward appearance are not strictly governed by the laws of nature or the arcane. For example, across versions, the mouth of the Aboleth alone has been described as toothless and rubbery, serrated, triangle-shaped, with and without a razor-lined gullet, a lamprey-like circular orifice with concentric rows of teeth, and my favorite, just a simple gaping maw. So we're not going to get bogged down on the details of the ever-evolving externalities of appearances, because that is not even close to its most interesting facet. What we will focus our efforts on is dissecting one of the most compelling anatomies and unique physical and metaphysical traits across any monster manual. And a little later, I have an entire chapter dedicated to the epistemology of the creature, which I believe is the single most fascinating and mysterious aspect of the Aboleth. In the truly unfortunate circumstance where you might happen to encounter an Aboleth up close, the first thing you will notice is their alien-esque serpent or eel-like body. Their spongy, otherworldly skin ranges from the various hues of grays and mottled blue-greens, although you likely would not be able to discern any colors through the murky cloud of their own rancid-smelling mucus nearly always shrouding the Aboleth when in water. This slimy mucus is actually a critical component protecting the Aboleth and produced by the millifast, a wholly unique and specialized organ found between the Aboleth's stomach and its rib cage. I'll expand on the role and importance of this secreting ooze in just a moment. The most common of Aboleth measure in at approximately 20 feet long and just under 7,000 pounds. That is what you will find in the 5e Monster Manual, although they do continue to grow as they age, reaching even greater sizes, and there are a myriad of variants we will detail in a dedicated chapter later in this volume. The largest Aboleth encountered by reputable adventurers was said to have measured over 50 feet long, but legends speak of even greater ancient variants that lurk in the deepest reaches of unseen waters, with tales of these monsters eclipsing 70 feet in length. Regardless of the variant type you encounter, know that each of their species is biologically immortal, meaning that if not killed by external means, such as disease or your sword and spell, they can theoretically live forever. Aboleth are also highly intelligent, in some cases incomprehensibly so. To illustrate this, most scholars agree that even the most common of species, likely considered dim-witted among their societal peers, is easily on par with the wisest humanoids in our realms. And you can find entire tomes of study and speculation in the Candlekeep archive suggesting that the most ancient of the Grand and Ruler variants possess a level of intelligence that lies beyond any mortal mind's ability to grasp its measure. In most cases, Aboleth also have 4 tentacles that are highly prehensile and sensitive, capable of both delicate manipulation and brutal constriction. Each tentacle can be used for propulsion, attacking, and for some variants of their species, communicating. Yeah, we'll circle back on that one. I'm telling you, these creatures are not of our world, literally. Aboleth are asexual and possessing of both male and female reproductive organs, allowing them to eschew the two-parent system of most mammals. Reproduction is never a part of the normal thought process for Aboleth, that is until they are suddenly seized with the instinctual urge to propagate their species. At that time, reproduction becomes a deeply personal process that is designed to occur in complete isolation. Our mortal understanding of this reproductive cycle is an aspect of their alien physiology that has undergone much change over time. That is to say, the more recent versions of Dungeons & Dragons have sadly removed a lot of the uniqueness of the process. In the earliest editions of our lore, the Aboleth laid a single egg and did so only once every 5 centuries, making that single opportunity to create new offspring critical as a matter of the species' survival. To that end, the Aboleth would take great care to protect their defenseless would-be spawn, keeping it safeguarded after fertilization at all costs. To do so, the zygote would be hidden away and encased in a thick cocoon consisting of a modified version of their enzymatic mucus, serving to both protect and nourish the nascent egg during this prolonged incubation. Initially about the size of a human head, the highly vulnerable egg grows ever so slowly over the next 5 years, gradually deforming into a 6-foot-long oblong-shaped shell, now resembling more like that of a slimy, pulsating carapace than any type of egg. I'm pretty sure I've seen something like that in the Alien movies. Once successfully hatched, the young Aboleth spawn begins a mutation in order to transform into a miniature version of its parent, a maturation process that takes an additional 10 years. In one of the more staggering aspects of this life cycle, the moment the young Aboleth enters the world, it instantly gains all the memories of every progenitor in its entire lineage. A perfect eidetic memory dating all the way back to its far realm ancestors. It's an astounding form of hyperthymesia on a scale of an entire heritage, truly extraordinary and an unimaginable attainment for mortals. And that's not even the most extreme version of the reproduction process as detailed in the early lore. The ruler, and perhaps the grand variant of the species as well, the latter being pure speculation on my part, were only able to mate a single time in their biologically immortal lives, and that 10-year maturation process I just detailed was estimated to reach 100 years. Of course, like most facets of our lore, as the editions advance, the difficulty, the complex, the extreme, and the unique become easier, simplified, mild, and more common. All leading us to the current process, which tells us that Aboleth now reproduce once every 5 years, not 500, and at which time it produces 1 to 3 eggs as opposed to just 1. However, as much as I don't like these evolved changes over recent versions, fortunately that prolonged 5-year incubation still remains, which provides several layers of depth to any encounter building. While the Aboleth may enlist other subordinate Aboleth, or their thralls, workers, and slaves, to care for their young during the post-hatching maturation, during that egg's incubation, those first 5 years, the Aboleth will not leave sight of the egg. Remember, during this highly vulnerable time, the Aboleth, as the sole single parent, is genetically driven to protect the zygote at all costs and above all else. Likely the only time in the entire life of an Aboleth where their plans of world domination and enslavement of races takes a back seat. This stark contrast from their normal priorities and behavior adds a wealth of encounter-building implications that I'm certain any creative DM or world builder will take full advantage of. Like so many of the exotic facets of Aboleth anatomy, the skin too is compelling enough to garner its own chapter. As mentioned earlier in the volume, from a distance the skin of the Aboleth appears as a mottled hue of grays and greens, not unlike so many other waterborne creatures. However, if you were able to inspect closer, you would be astounded at the almost supernatural qualities of the Aboleth protective sheath we call skin. Shimmering with the prismatic brilliance of the entire spectrum, both on and beneath the spongy, opaque skin, this hazy ballet of colors is the visual evidence of the inherent psionic energies that course through this ancient primordial. You will notice that according to the 5e Monster Manual text, the Aboleth are able to breathe both air and water. And while that is technically true, this description does very little to help illustrate the stunning mechanisms at play to make that a reality. The Aboleth do not actually breathe water as do most non-mammalian aquatic beings, nor do they breathe air as do most land-dwelling creatures. In fact, the Aboleth do not even possess gills or lungs. Using the thick water-resistant mucus produced by the millithast, the skin of the Aboleth behaves like that of a membrane organ, able to accommodate the intake of oxygen in or out of water. While not fully understood even by the wisest scholars of the realms, speculation suggests that the closest mortal analogues to help grasp this wondrous process borrows from both the zoological study of the animal kingdom and the botanical knowledge of the various flora both of the land and seas. There we find two principles at play: the series of chemical reactions of photosynthesis to use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide to oxygen, and the diffusion of water through a semi-permeable membrane through the process of osmosis. When the enzymatic substance is secreted onto the Aboleth skin, it interacts in a chemical reaction with the surrounding water to create a thick cloud of mucus that the membrane skin of the Aboleth can diffuse and in effect breathe. This osmotic process being similar to one easily witnessed in the wrinkled prune-like human fingers after prolonged exposure to water. With the Aboleth able to survive on land or sea, yes, this means it is quite possible, although uncommon and not native, for the Aboleth to travel on land when necessary, although that can be a perilous decision. When out of the water, the Aboleth must take precautions to ensure that their membrane-like skin does not dry out. As remarkable as the millithos secretion is, water is still required to facilitate the breathing process of the skin. However, should the skin dry out, that does not prove fatal in and of itself. Instead, the Aboleth would eventually enter a state of suspended animation, called the long dreaming. During this process, the outer layer of the skin transforms into a tough, almost mineral-like shell and immobilizes the creature. While in the long dreaming state, it is suggested the Aboleth remain well aware of its surroundings. It can hear and see, but cannot detect odors or feel tactile sensations. It retains the ability to think and observe, but it can take no actions, not even efforts that are purely mental. Inside, it remains hydrated enough for the basic functions to sustain life. However, should an Aboleth in this state be badly cut or somehow pierced, that moisture would leak out and rapidly lead to the creature's death. However, if left undisturbed, the Aboleth can remain in this state indefinitely. But lacking any ability to take any even mental actions on its own behalf, the long dreaming becomes a state and a fate that most Aboleth consider far worse than death. Aboleth possess a remarkable repertoire of communication methods, but what may strike you as the most surprising and impressive is their ability to write. Limited to the more advanced of their species, such as the noble variants, Aboleth can communicate by creating written messages using a complex symbol or glyph system, not unlike ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, for example. These ancient symbols are believed to communicate entire thoughts, emotions, and concepts as opposed to words, and does so in such a way that it is very difficult for other races to decipher. Now, you might be asking yourself, how? How does a sea creature with no arms or hands write, let alone do so underwater? It's a fair question, and very appropriate for such an unconventional process. For some Aboleth, namely those variants above the common species, their aforementioned 4 tentacles are tipped with extremely sensitive thimble-like crystals, and those mineralized tips are then coated with a dense water-resistant acid, another enzymatic and chemical transformation produced by the highly specialized millithast organ I mentioned earlier and facilitated by their remarkable skin. Using all 4 tentacles in coordination, the Aboleth etch their intricate system of language consisting of runes and glyphs directly onto stone, metal, or other hard surfaces. However, this complex system of writing is not without its drawbacks. Restricted to etchings on hard surfaces via acid limits the Aboleth ability to communicate on more flexible materials such as parchment or paper, not to mention they are, in water. This, coupled with the time required to carve the etchings, plus their already impressive memory, Aboleth are not writing reminder notes to themselves, all results in this impressive but inefficient system being the least used and rarest of their communication tools. Still, a water-based species to possess such an ability only highlights one of the many amazing aspects of the Aboleth. Aboleth also possess their own ancient spoken language known as deep speech. Filled with guttural tones, clicks, pops, and complex inflections, these sounds are able to articulate entire concepts which no surface language can adequately convey. The language is as old as the species and enormously complex. Even with a lifetime of training, the mortal mind is simply incapable of grasping any but the most basic of meanings. Part of this complexity comes from the coordination of multiple sounds from multiple mouths, simultaneously and in unison to communicate the more complex dialects. Yes, you heard that right. Many Aboleth, in fact, have multiple secondary mouths, mainly found along the sides of their form. Often mistaken for gills or even eyes, these mouths are not used for feeding, but instead serve a dual and alternative purpose. First, serving as a sensory organ in much the same way a serpent uses its tongue to smell. And second, these ancillary mouths are used in concert to facilitate their deep speech. Depending upon a number of factors, including variant type, age, and many inherent characteristics not fully understood, a particular specimen will have a varied number of these ancillary mouths, the ascending number of which can be roughly correlated to an ever-increasing ability to form more advanced sounds, words, and even entire concepts. While lesser variants, even those with only a single mouth, are still able to communicate through deep speech, they are severely limited to only the simplest of words and concepts. In much the same way, you can play Beethoven's Fifth on an accordion, but it will sound much different if played by the Chicago Symphony or the Vienna Philharmonic. That is to say, to an Aboleth, the former comes off sounding uncultured and dull-witted. Lucky for those lesser Aboleth, deep speech is not commonly spoken, reserved for rituals or conversations that are too intricate or sacred for their most primary form of communication, telepathy. Still, it's a fascinating case study in communication, a language that resonates with the ocean's depth, often felt as much as it is heard, and echoing the primordial origins of its speakers. As mortal observers looking to gain knowledge and wisdom in our study of the Aboleth, I think it's important that we perform our analysis with the resignation that some of our discoveries will be difficult or perhaps even impossible to comprehend. And at the center of that incomprehension is one of the most captivating of anatomical studies across any creature in the multiverse. the brain, and the otherworldly mnemonic abilities of the Aboleth. At the very core of this ancient creature's consciousness resides a repository of knowledge and memory so vast that it borders on and is perhaps indistinguishable from magic. These memories stretch back to the very dawn of time, before even the gods themselves came to be. Unlike the fleeting, ephemeral memories of lesser mortal beings such as you and I, the recall of the Aboleth is infallible and utterly indisputable. These are not echoes of a past, but an historical and all-encompassing record of all time. It offers a perspective that transcends our own understanding of the concepts of memory, time, and to a degree, even existence. Now, you might counter that many aberrant species have powerful and mysterious brains. And you'd be correct. The well-chronicled beholder, for example, is able to harness its own imagination to warp reality and create malevolent offspring. Creating life from imagination is pretty impressive. I know what the 13-year-old Rich would do with that kind of power. We've all seen Weird Science, right? But I offer for your consideration that the mind of an Aboleth is even more impressive. Beyond a repository holding infinite knowledge, this perfect ancestral memory of the Aboleth is a navigable conduit of the past, woven from the mnemonic threads of their entire lineage, as well as any and all beings they've consumed. And with this beautiful mind, the Aboleth can, at any time, choose to descend into the abyss of their own consciousness, where they can traverse through the swirling currents of millennia past, even memories not of their own, to experience firsthand the triumphs and tragedies of their forebears with picture-perfect clarity. A high-definition journey, if you will, that transcends the boundaries of linear time. They can witness the rise and fall of civilizations as if unfolding in real time, learning from the mistakes of the past. In this way, such memories serve as a source of continual strategic training, making the Aboleth one of the grand strategists in all the multiverse. This perfect genetic and racial memory is so powerful that calling it an advanced memory borders on gross inaccuracy, as that mortal term and our understanding of its function is far too confining for this immeasurable alien-like ability. The Aboleth have surveyed every great war, every natural disaster, and they have done so on many worlds across the entirety of the multiverse. They remember the primordial darkness that gave birth to the gods, and the wars against those deities that brought ruin to their empires, leaving the Aboleth as pioneers, but now isolated to the dark waters of the realms. They remember, and they long deeply to reclaim their place of domination in a domain they believe as an absolute truth that they founded. The enslavement and domination of lesser creatures is a regular practice for the lawful evil Aboleth. And that is, by any mortal measure, a cruel and merciless practice, one driven by a dispassionate logic that views all other beings as either tools to be exploited or threats to be neutralized. Yet, when viewed through the lens of the Aboleth, a near-immortal creature that counts its age not in years but on a scale of eons, their horrific experiments on intelligent humanoid species seem no more cruel to them than you or I may view the destruction of a wasp hive, an anthill, or a mouse burrow. Of course, that view is certainly colored differently when you are the mouse. The word Aboleth means God, and when you look at their aberrant characteristics, biological immortality, potent psionic capabilities, and perfect ancestral memory, some might posit the Aboleth are simply acting in accordance with what is their reality. Central to this Abolethic truth is the decree that lesser beings exist only to serve them. Why else would the Aboleth be so well equipped to manipulate, control, and devastate the mortal mind? It's not a hollow argument. Through their formidable psionic powers, the Aboleth can command telepathically across great distances, unleashing psionic assaults that can overwhelm even the most resilient of minds. This telepathic mastery is a weapon of subjugation refined over millennia, a profound domination that transcends the physical realm and yet is as natural to the Aboleth as breathing is to lesser beings. The process of domination begins with the psionic strike, a wave of mental energy, not a spell, that penetrates the minds of its victims, implanting a potent suggestion that compels obedience. This suggestion is so powerful that only the strongest of wills can hope to resist. For most, Aboleth domination is absolute, stripping away free will. Once compromised, the Aboleth can choose to deploy its viscous gray mucus on the enslaved as a conduit for continued control. As it makes contact with the victim's body, it begins a horrific transformation, altering the skin into a pale membrane that allows, in fact requires, underwater breathing. But it is also a symbolic chaining, binding the victim's existence to its master's whims. Because without the sickly, rancid, yet now life-giving mucus, the victim will perish. And it's here we should add some context to distinguish the Abolethic hierarchy of servitude, specifically the differences between those who are enslaved, the slave species called scum, and those we call thralls. The enslaved are captured mortals whose minds have been fully dominated by the potent psionics of the Aboleth. They have no will of their own and exist solely to serve the Aboleth desires. These enslaved victims are completely subservient to the commands of the Aboleth and lack any real semblance of autonomy or even independent thought. They serve as the most loyal and obedient minions of the Aboleth, executing its master's will without question. The vast majority of enslaved are also then transformed into aquatic forms by way of the Aboleth mucus. This way they can best serve the Aboleth below the depths, as they would be of little use to their master Aboleth if upon land. Scum, unlike the enslaved, are actually a dedicated race of aquatic slaves bred specifically to serve as minions. Introduced in the 3rd edition, they are a pale, terrible fusion of humanoid and cephalopod. And finally, we have the thralls. Unlike the enslaved or scum, thralls retain some degree of autonomy and independent thought, albeit at the control and wishes of their Aboleth master. Thralls can come from various races and backgrounds, including humanoid adventurers, townsfolk, and even powerful spellcasters. In fact, most thralls serve the Aboleth willingly and have no suspicion of being mentally dominated. They are compelled by various combinations of psionic domination, powerful mental illusions, and straight-up manipulation, often in the form of empty, deceitful promises of power or knowledge. Thralls often go completely undetected across the realms, where they act as emissaries, agents, or intermediaries for the Aboleth interests on land. They can be found carrying out tasks or spreading their influence in vast cults. Or they may be used to acquire or spread misinformation through elaborate cabals, for example, and doing so while retaining a significant degree of their individuality. Within Aboleth societies and cities beneath the waves, these minions also serve additional and diverse roles. Some are servants to Aboleth needs, others mere laborers. Many will become part of an attacking force or serve as guardians protecting their master's lair or other locations of importance. The more astute and wise of thralls may become advisors or strategists, their knowledge and skills now co-opted. And yet still others are left as nothing more than humanoid lab rats, used by the high-minded noble Aboleth in their cruel testing of theories and experiments, probing the ever-shifting boundaries of life and death. For those times and occasions where something more subtle than the direct mind-bending of their psionic attacks are required, the cunning Aboleth may deploy the use of a less direct but no less sinister method of subjugation and oppression, leveraging the manipulation of desire itself. Able to psionically probe minds telepathically, the Aboleth learn the victim's deepest wants and aspirations. The Aboleth will then entice with false promises of having those desires fulfilled. Calling upon their profound psionic energies again, they will override the senses and cast vivid mind illusions, trapping victims in elaborate webs of deception where they willingly serve, oblivious that their dream fulfillment is nothing more than a deceitful fabrication and a powerful illusion. By now, there should be little doubt the ability of the Aboleth to shackle the mind of the mortal is absolute. Its mastery in the art of enslavement unquestioned. Yet it is in their most nefarious of methods for expanding Aboleth influence that we truly find the extent and insidious terror of their reach. Leaning hard into the Lovecraftian narratives, you will find that in remote lakes and coastal regions across the realms, entire harbor villages and seaside towns have fallen under the tyranny of the Aboleth. It all begins discreetly enough as key individuals, a respected elder, a friendly merchant, or a civic leader, now psychically compromised through dread psionic powers, implanted false memories, and dominant mental illusions. As these initial pawns act upon the silent commands of their master, the wave of corruption slowly but insidiously spreads like a plague unseen. Neighbors, friends, families, all ensnared in a psychological web of treachery until an entire populace is subjugated into bondage. The town, now a lure in the Abolethic game of domination, a welcoming facade of hospitable and friendly thralls, an elaborate trap for unsuspecting travelers who are then overwhelmed into oppression and servitude by psychic might. Some become new thralls, reshaped to serve upon the land, continuing the cycle of ensnarement and entrapment, while others face far darker fates below the surface. Through psionic domination, physical transformation, and good old-fashioned manipulation, the Aboleth influence spreads like a cancer, slowly consuming region by region, subjugating all in its path. A myopic, relentless, and dispassionate pursuit of dominance for world control and all life within it. Time, it seems, has been a blank canvas for the evolution of the Aboleth, and in the eons they have existed, a wide array of terrifying variants have come into existence. Though all share the legacy of a vast intellect and a thirst for domination, each branch of this Aboleth tree is its own unique expression of experimentation in the pursuit of their own perfection. First, we have the common Aboleth, the template from which all variants spring. This is the species you will find in the 5th edition Monster Manual, the no-frills base model as I like to call them, but they are also referred to as slavers, befitting their primary objective of subjugating the lesser species of the realm at the command of the more advanced Aboleth in order to create the various minions that serve the species. Rising from those common ranks are the greater Aboleth. One of the first to evolve, they are both larger and more cunning in every respect. Where the common Aboleth hunt for slaves, the greater Aboleth rule over them. Its enhanced psionic prowess binding countless minds to its will, their size often exceeding 40 feet, is matched only by their increased intellect, which they leverage to maintain the complex social order of their submerged cities and to breed their enslaved populations to create the scum minion variant. Then there are the nobles. Among the most intelligent, they are also the most cruel, in the name of scientific advancement. While all Aboleth have a greater appetite for knowledge, the noble variants are consumed by its acquisition, so much so that their physical forms have evolved over millennia, their tentacles now sophisticated into precise, some might even say delicate manipulators, signifying their ascension from brute force to the refined mastery of experimental research and written communication. Where they find magic anathema, science is divine, and the noble Aboleth take the greatest pleasure exploring realms of knowledge so alien they would twist the minds of most surface-dwelling scholars into knots of madness. To anyone that has watched my ongoing 9 Hells series, it will not come as a surprise to learn that one of my favorite Aboleth variants are the Stygian, introduced in the Lords of Madness resource for 3.5. As that lore goes, eons ago, a vast city of colossal Aboleth performed a remarkable feat. Some might say of magic, others of psionic will. Regardless, in its success, they were able to transport an entire realm of Aboleth minions to the 5th layer of the 9 Hells, the frozen plain of Stygia. One can only assume they did this in alignment with the ruler of Stygia, Levistus, with perhaps some future sinister intent in mind. Nevertheless, over time, the fiendish influence of the Batazu has altered these Aboleth, imbuing them with the infernal power of that frigid layer. Their forms now evolved to better adapt to extreme cold and taking on the colors and the cruelty of the Gelugons who they share the lair with, ultimately creating a new species known as the Stygian Aboleth. And the Lords of Madness ends their own profile on this variant, positing a potential future where these Aboleth could evolve into a distinct and new kind of devil, at which time I would need to alter my own hierarchy of the 9 hells. Nearing the zenith of the Abolethic hierarchy sit the rulers, Aboleth who command entire cities. Physically, ruler Aboleth are even more massive still and possess stronger psionic abilities. The ruler variants are said to always exceed 50 and sometimes 60 feet in length, with intelligence on par with that of the noble variants. Each city has but one ruler, and its primary responsibility is to maintain the social order. To best accomplish this, the ruler variant are masters of long-range telepathy, able to tap into a vast psionic network constructed by the Grand Aboleth, creating a tether that binds every Aboleth under their sway across vast stretches of the deep. Sitting at the apex of the Abolethic hierarchy is the Grand Aboleth. These truly massive creatures are the largest of their kind, said to exceed 70 feet in length and possessing the most extreme of psionic and telepathic abilities. The Grand Aboleth are said to be limited to only a few per world, and each has built a vast psionic network that allows simultaneous communication with any and all Aboleth across distances rumored to exceed 10,000 miles, giving each Grand Aboleth complete knowledge of all of its subjects. Commanding untold Aboleth across the species, the Grand Variant oversees the activities of dozens, maybe even hundreds of Aboleth cities, and does so assisted by the most elite of their noble variants, all while hidden in the deepest parts of the world, protected by loyal subjects and minions that number in the thousands. There, in those lightless depths, the Grand Aboleth formulate their plans on a global level, the machinations they believe will one day take back their worlds. Legends tell of one Grand Aboleth upon Faerun. Simply called the Eldest, this Grand Variant is of incalculable age and commands the Abolethic citadel of Shifu, the tentacled city surrounded in perpetual storm and hovering over the sea of fallen stars. There are still many other noteworthy variants, such as the amphibious Aboleth, who are better suited for prolonged exposure out of water, or the deep variants, who are well adapted to the extreme pressures and cold, not of the deep oceans, but the abyssal layers, where these chaotic Aboleth species can be found. Then there are the lair Aboleth, perhaps the most reclusive of all. These Aboleth have settled in the deepest caverns or the most ancient of wrecks and ruins, all in the most isolated and hidden reaches of the worlds. Preferring to never leave their deep-sea homes, they have developed remarkable powers to wield control over specific characteristics and the elemental properties of the regional territories they command. This includes their ability to mold and manipulate the very stone and water of their lairs, creating intricate traps and specialized defenses to ward off potential intruders. To round out this chapter, we find the ultra-rare aerial variant. These Aboleth, also introduced in the 3rd edition, have evolved the ability to fly, while all but abandoning their aquatic abilities. These exotic flyers are one of the more rare sights on the prime material plane, and I personally question if they are Aboleth at all. Each of these variants, with only a few fringe exceptions like the aerial, hold important roles dictated by their ordered Abolethic culture, a society that is sophisticated but also merciless and driven to conquer. Keen observers will notice I left out a few variants from the last chapter, specifically the Savant introduced in the 3.5 Monstrous Compendium Volume 2 and a 4th edition variant called the Slime Mage. I mention them now only as a matter of completeness and as a lead-in for my editorial on the use of magic in Abolethic society. Throughout the first 3 editions of the lore through 3rd edition, the Aboleth were created and curated as a highly unique, ancient, even alien-like terror. Their extraordinary abilities had always been psionic and stemmed from their remarkable mind. This is further evidenced by its sheer size. The Aboleth brain takes up 17% of their mass, roughly 8 times that of most humanoids, and consumes so much biologic energy the Aboleth anatomy has 2 hearts, one dedicated solely to that amazing brain. I tell you this because until the launch of the Savant and the Mage variant that followed, the essence of all Aboleth power was psionic, their minds capable of manipulating the fabric of reality through sheer force of will. This innate power is central to their identity, shaping their biology, their society, and their interaction with the world around them. That is, until the magic seal was cracked when these arcane variants were so rudely introduced to the lore. There exist a myriad of references in the earlier lore that strongly infer the Aboleth rejection of magic, despising its use and viewing it as inferior, even destabilizing. In my humble opinion, the use of arcane magic is fundamentally incompatible with their lore and psionic nature, and only serves to undermine their unique identity by diluting their powers of mental domination and will. It's probably not a hill worth dying on, but I think the Aboleth are one of the most compelling and unique monsters across versions, and I personally don't like the idea of an Aboleth wizard wearing a Harry Potter hat and casting lightning bolts. But that's just me and my table. What's canon at your table is what your table decides. As we close out an Abolethic volume, I hope you find as deep as the oceans from which they dwell. As promised, I would like to leave you with some DM and world-building tips I feel pretty strongly about for your consideration. These are recommendations that have resulted in some very memorable encounters and adventures for me personally, and I hope some of you may find them useful. It all starts with a clear understanding of the vision you have for the role an Aboleth might play in your world. Regardless of challenge rating or variant type, the Aboleth make excellent use of what can loosely be described as a 3-act structure for its revelation. Early in your campaign, Act 1, the Aboleth is treated as an ancient hidden force that guides or distracts your party, influencing other tangentially related forces, but always unseen, unknowable, and even unconnectable at this early stage. As you've learned today, the Aboleth will always operate from a position of superior intellect, and as a grand strategist, they can easily manipulate unseen and untraceable from the deep, dark waters. As your campaign moves into Act 2, only now should there be even trace elements of foreshadowing. As a DM, there is nothing more satisfying than looking back at balanced, well-placed, and perfectly timed hints, subtext, and insinuation. For me, this is the secret sauce that will make or break an encounter. And in this early to mid-stage, I think the best place to start with foreshadowing is the environmental surroundings, specifically using the regional effects of the Aboleth. There are some listed on page 14 of the 5e Monster Manual, but I would absolutely not be bound to just these. Get creative and theme them to align with your campaign. Foul, discolored water, dead or diseased flora and fauna, ancient Lovecraftian art or architecture. And I think at some point the mucus of the Aboleth should make its appearance, slimy terrain, found on decaying wildlife or dead trees, and don't forget the smell, described best as rancid. As your Act 2 comes to an end, perhaps the savvy group has some form of sea monster on their short list of suspects, but hopefully the true identity is still well veiled. As Act 3 opens, be sure and course correct as needed with more or less foreshadowing, and a lot of this will have to be dictated by the specifics of your adventure. For example, if the Aboleth has taken control of a small seaside hamlet, now would be a good time to drop breadcrumbs to entice your players to investigate the area if they're not already on the trail. Upon arrival, they might soon notice only slightly odd behavior in a certain percentage of its citizenry. Remember that the primary goal of any thralls under Aboleth sway would be to recruit and transport fresh bodies for enslavement. And it's important here to reinforce that thralls in service to the Aboleth will not be some mindless zombies. In fact, for all intents and purposes, they are completely in control of their own actions, nearly undetectable save for minor behavioral changes. These enthralled souls will most likely not even be aware of their own bondage, rationalizing their servitude as true freedom, their vile acts as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of all, but a good that doesn't really exist beyond the psionic illusory veil over the thrall's mind. Still, the hints will be present. A councilman talking to himself, or the whispered conversations with his unseen master. The incessant twitching of a once stalwart guard, or a small group of villagers eerily speaking scripted words in unison on matters of faith or false good deeds. These are the only real outward signs of this insidious reach of an Aboleth. Perhaps a hidden cult has formed deep underground. You could drop subtle hints such as strange and repeated symbols carved in odd places, weird bouts of telepathic intrusion upon their minds, the white noise or errant feedback of the psionic powers permeating throughout the village. Just remember a good rule of thumb. Before your players ever lay eyes on this ancient being, they must tangibly feel its presence. Using the Aboleth should almost always be the culmination of an adventure or a campaign, and its reveal should be a slow burn. You allow it to seep into the minds of your players, challenging them to confront not only the physical might of this ancient alien, but also the psychological assault of its ominous presence. And then, of course, when the time is right, the Aboleth itself is revealed. For me, it's a no-brainer that the Aboleth follow a Lovecraftian-like narrative, a study in horror, vast, overwhelming, and ancient. Its size alone is a declaration of its dominance. You don't want to just use the Aboleth, you want to unleash it. And to that end, if the challenge rating 10 stat block from the 5e Monster Manual is not sufficient, and for many it won't be, I would recommend looking at perhaps swapping out part or all of the 5e Kraken stat block as a quick and dirty means to empower, say, a greater, noble, or even ruler Aboleth. And if providing some homebrew stat blocks for the variants, creating some legendary abilities and lair actions is of interest to you, either as a PDF supplement on my Patreon, as another video volume, or both, be sure to let me know down in the comments. And finally today, I will leave you with a most fitting Abolethic quote I found on Reddit literally 4 or 5 years ago. So I take no credit for it, but I wrote it down in my Trapper Keeper tome all those years ago, and still find it to perfectly encapsulate the arrogance, dominance, and sheer cruelty of the Aboleth. I recently looked it up again just so I could give proper credit. Most assuredly a homebrew, let me set the scene. A large Aboleth named Molmeg the Permanent is speaking down to the last remaining member of an adventuring group, a cowering and broken mortal soul who just watched his friends devoured one by one, and in the cruelest of ways, preferred by Molmeg using psionic domination to compel each to beg him for their death. My hat is off to this Reddit user who I believe is the original author, Jack is so cool. And with this quote, I'm inclined to agree. Pretty cool indeed.
Ants have grand plans. They build elaborate structures over the course of generations. From an ant's perspective, their societies are complex and eternal. They aren't. They are but mounds in the sand, and the sea comes to wash them away. The sea is eternal, and it washes away their pathetic homes. I am the sea. You are less than ants. Now beg for me to kill you, like your friends did.
And that concludes our dive into the ancient alien terror of the deep, the Aboleth. What do you think of the Aboleth before and after this analysis? Did you learn anything new? What would you like to see dissected in the next Monster Lab? Let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel and keep the content sponsor-free, please check out the links below. Free Patreon memberships, free Discord access, and Buy Me a Coffee donation links. And if you think I earned it, maybe like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.